to another A-level biology video with Mr. Phillips, and today we're going to be continuing looking at the populations and ecosystems module by looking at what causes variation in population size and focusing on biotic and abiotic factors. So what you need to be aware of is what a population is. So a population, think about it how we would use the term, we'd say like the population of dolphins in the Yangtze River or something like that. So a population is all the individuals of a particular species living in a particular habitat at the same time. So that could be, for example, the population of people living in the Isle of Man at the moment is 200,000. It could be the population of E. coli living in your guts at this moment is 10 million, or the population of a hidden dinosaur living in Loch Ness in Scotland is 0, or 1, depending on what you believe. There's another term which links this called community, and this is how the populations of a different species make up a habitat. So if you think about the word community as a human term, we would say like all the different groups of humans in an area make a community, and therefore a community is a population of different species that make up one habitat. Now, when we talk about understanding populations, we need to remember that populations are not a stable thing, they're dynamic. So what that means is they generally oscillate. They might stay relatively stable, but overall they will sort of oscillate. And this will depend on balance of birth rate to mortality rate. And obviously if you're talking about bacteria, so the word birth rate probably isn't the most appropriate, so you might say that the cell division rate or something like that compared to mortality rate. And it's not fully understood, even these days, exactly why populations always change. With a huge amount of research, it's still quite difficult. So things like lemmings, there's myths about why the populations suddenly crash, and actually scientific research in these areas is quite important because it needs to then apply to maybe human populations or biodiversity populations. So to understand this module and why populations change, we need to understand what an ecosystem is. So a word that you should be familiar with, that an ecosystem is the interaction of the community of living organisms, so the biotic factors, with the non-living parts, the abiotic factors. And to survive, they must have this constant source of material. So we need to have the biotic and abiotic in sort of balance. So what you could do now is, if you want to, pause this video and have a go answering this question. We'll come back to the answer for this later. Okay, so here's the answer for this video. Basically, what's happening in different stages of the population growth. So A, you've got what we call the lag phase, which is when basically the bacteria start producing the right enzymes. They start getting digesting the food sources, the nutrient sources, and that means that they basically have to get used to the environment. They're acclimatizing, okay? And that means the population doesn't go up that much. Then at B, we get to the exponential phase, or the log phase, or something called the geometric phase, and that's where cells start dividing at a rapid rate because there's high amounts of resources and there are very few bacteria effectively, so therefore the population can grow unstopped. And then you get to sort of C, which is the stationary phase, where the population plateaus, and that's because the amount of resources become depleted. It might be because the overcrowding and competition increases, what we call intraspecific competition between the same species, and cell divisions in terms of bacteria equals cell death. And C, when it levels off, it's what we call the carrying capacity, the maximum population a species can have in that habitat. Now what might happen is D, you might get down to the decline stage, which is where mortality rate is greater than cell division rate. But it depends on the population, and if you're growing bacteria for a reason, you might add extra nutrients in there. So often you'll just be asked to stop talking at the C point, but always follow it based on the graph you're given in the exam. So different abiotic factors, just to remind you, can affect where an organisms live and the numbers, so such as these ones listed here. I always think about it as plants to try and think about what affects a plant growth, because then I tend to remember most of them, but obviously I can apply most of those to animals, bacteria, fungus, whatever living organism you're looking at. And then we've also got the biotic factors, so this includes the introducing new food sources, the removal of the food sources, when new predators introduced, pathogens and microbes are obviously biotic, and new competitors which cause either intra or interspecific competition, which we'll look at later on. So looking at interspecific competition, and the key thing here is being very careful with this and not confusing these two terms. So looking at interspecific competition, this is the competition between different species for the same resource. So we talked in the previous video about niches and said that when any two species occupy virtually the same niche, it doesn't like they occupy the exact same niche, but when they occupy a similar niche, they will compete for each other. And what will happen is both populations, the numbers will drop because the populations are both going to take an impact by the fact they're having to compete for these resources. And that means they get less food, less warmth, less good conditions in terms of like their nest sites and things like that, and therefore they're going to get less energy for growth, and that energy means they'll be less successful at reproduction, and therefore the populations drop. However, what will generally happen is that one of the two species will end up being less well adapted to the situation, and therefore they'll be outcompeted in the long term because the resources for that species will be reduced by too much. And an example of this is happened in the UK between the two different species of squirrel, the red and grey squirrel. So the red squirrel was the native squirrel to the UK, and then through boats we accidentally introduced, and shipping used to take place a lot more between the US and England in the early 1800s. We introduced the grey squirrel, and what happened then was the grey squirrel outcompetes the red squirrel for food, habitats. And that means that they get more, because they're better at getting the food, they end up with more fat over the winter, and they survive more over those difficult winter months, whereas the red squirrel has slowly been wiped out in parts of the UK. And obviously we're trying to maintain it by reducing the grey squirrel populations, in particular northern areas of the UK. Now the other word for that is, or type of competition, sorry, is intra-specific competition. So this one is for competition within the same species. So if you think about humans, human populations do intra-specific competition when we go to war or something like that. It is just the competition between the same species. Now, what this causes is a cyclical change in population size. So let's say we were competing for food. Okay, the population will drop as the competition goes on too much because we run out of resources. But then as the population drops, there'd be less pressure on that original resource, then the population increases. So you have this sort of up and down sort of cycle change. So if you look here, and it says on link to this textbook scan here, it says there were lots of resources available. So at first, the rabbits, in this case, population went up. Then the resources run out, so the population dropped as a result. But then because the population's dropped, there's less impact on there's less need for the resources, so therefore there's lots of resources available again, and then the population increases, so the resources become limited again, population drops, so there's plenty of resources, and so on and so on. So there's constant build up and then crash of the population as the resources become scarce. Now we can also see relationships between predator and prey, and they can affect the numbers of either of themselves in a population. So you need to understand the word predator is they're organisms that kill and eat each other or eat another organism for food. So if you think about this in a different way, think about the prey as being the resource here for the predator. And that will hopefully make you realise if you've got no resource, you can't have any predator. If you have lots of resources, your predator numbers will go up. So here you can see there's always a lag between the two, and it's not the greatest graph, and I'll talk about why in a second, but this shows you that the prey is always higher numbers at first. We've got the prey number here. Now, because we've got high prey numbers, what that means is there's lots of food for the predators. So the predator number then increases. Okay, so we get to this point here where the predator number increases. But then what happens, as a result of the predator numbers getting high, the prey numbers decrease. And as a result then, the predators run out of food, and the predator numbers then decrease as well. But then, because the predators have died out because they haven't had enough food, there's less pressure on the prey, and the prey are more successful, and they increase their numbers again, and then there's more food available for the predators. So the predators increase themselves again until the predator numbers get too high, and then the prey numbers drop down again because there's too much biotic factors influencing them, i.e. predators, and then the predator numbers will follow as well. Now, why I said this graph might be slightly wrong is because generally you have always a higher population of prey than predators. So I'd always say prey numbers should be slightly higher than predator numbers at the top of the peak. So we've studied this in very controlled conditions because it's quite an interesting area to look at. So what they did is they looked at, in the laboratory, predation in two species of mite. There's a predator mite and a prey mite. And what they did is a setup where they basically set up different biospheres or ecosystems using oranges that the mites, the prey mite lives on. So the prey mite was introduced, the prey mite's population increased, it jumped from orange to orange. Then they introduced predator mites. And what happened was the prey mites numbers went up and down and the predator mites numbers followed it as well. So we sort of saw that the prey numbers rise at first because there was a lack of predators and lots of food, but then the predator numbers were introduced and the predator numbers increased because they had lots of prey to eat. Then the prey obviously disappeared, so the predator numbers dropped, and then when the predators decreased, then the prey numbers could increase as well. Now in the wild it's not as clear because there are a lot of other factors, abiotic or biotic, influencing the success rate of the predator or the prey. So if you have a look at this example, this shows you the link between the lynx, which is like a big, a predatory cat. Okay, so the lynx is your predator, and the hare, which is the prey. And you can see here, if you follow the numbers slightly, you've got high lynx numbers at first, then there's not much food, so the lynx numbers drops. As the lynx numbers drops, the hare numbers increase, and you can follow that pattern throughout. Now it's not as easy in the wild due to so many external factors. So you can see there is a general pattern that when the hare numbers on this graph, which is a bit more clearer, the hare numbers increase high, that is soon followed by the predator numbers increasing afterwards. So the predator's got lots of food. Then when you've got high predator numbers again, the prey number decreases, and that means that there's less food for the predators, so the predator number drops again as a result. Then because the predators have dropped, there's less biotic pressure on the prey, on the hares, so the hare numbers increased, and that's rapidly followed by the predators. And that can be seen on different situations throughout the time. Now, one point to point out though is we're not that sure, even studying this, how well this is actually linked together, because if you look at this bottom point here from this textbook, on one island in Canada there are no links, and yet there are still these increases and decreases in population at all times. So there's other things that could happen, like for example the hares could die of a disease because they overpopulate, and we know myxomatosis in rabbits, for example, it kills a lot of rabbits if the populations get too high. So there are other factors at play here, and that's important to remember. And you can get different graphs looking at different things to do with population. So this one links weeds and an actual grain, so it's not always just predator and prey. Now what happens is predators hit something called the K line here, which is called the carrying capacity, and this is the upper limit that a population can get to, because it reaches the limit of the resources of that environment. So it's the upper limit of a population that the environment can sustain. It's called the carrying capacity. But what causes it? Well, it'll all be due to stuff like the resources, the space, all these things interlinked, all those abiotic and biotic factors. And what happens is you can have two types of population. One population might be one that goes up and just stays, like the previous graph showed, just below the carrying capacity. Other populations do a boom and bust thing, where they'll increase, jump way over the carrying capacity, and then collapse. And then humans, as we said, we're always worried about resources because we feel like we're getting close to that carrying capacity at the moment. So just to remind you, they might talk about limiting factors in an exam. So a limiting factor is anything that limits the population from increasing and could cause that carrying capacity. So it might be different things you might talk about. So bacteria in nutrient buff, limited resources such as oil in humans, space because it could cause stress. For example, battery farm animals, a lot of them die due to stress. And then diseases such as myxomatosis in rabbits, which is linked with overcrowding. So I hope that's been useful for you guys, and again, I'll see you soon for the next video.